At 7 o'clock in the evening on January 28, 2022, police arrived at Vale Green in Norwich to find an 18-year-old dying in the road. His name was Joe Dix. He was clutching a 24-inch sword, a weapon he hadn't brought to the fight. 7 stab wounds covered his body. He'd been chased, attacked, and left to bleed out on a street less than a mile from his home. Within the hour, he would be dead. But to understand how Joe Dix ended up in that road, you have to rewind 60 minutes. To 6:48 p.m., Joe at home in Mile Cross. His phone rings. On the other end, someone he knows, someone dealing drugs from a flat in Vale Green. 3 men have turned up, trying to rob the place. The dealer can't stop them alone. He needs help. Joe answers. Joe gets up. Joe goes. That decision, made in less time than it takes to describe it, is where this story begins. Not in a courtroom months later. Not in a police interview room where 3 teenagers would sit in silence, refusing to speak. It begins with a phone call and a choice. Joe Dix ran toward danger for someone else. The 3 young men who killed him, Benjamin Gill, Cameron Palmer and Hans B. Harry, came to Vale Green with a plan, a car and 4 weapons, including that sword. Within 60 minutes, Joe would be dead. The 3 young men who killed him had been planning their evening for hours. This is how a robbery became a murder. Welcome to UK True Crime Files, where we dig into the cases that scar Britain's communities, giving voice to the victims at their heart. If you're new here, please subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming straight to your feed, and it ensures families like Joe's aren't forgotten between news cycles. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case. It starts conversations that matter. This is the Joe Dix case, and we're going to take you through all of it. Joe Dix was 18 years old. He lived in Mile Cross, a working-class estate on the northern edge of Norwich. Not a place tabloids write about unless something goes wrong. Not a postcode that gets much attention at all until a teenager dies there. Joe wasn't a saint. He wasn't a statistic either. He was a young man navigating the same streets as Benjamin Gill, Cameron Palmer, and Hans B. Harry. The same city, the same economy, the same choices about who to trust and what risks to take. Mile Cross and Vale Green sit close together in Norwich's geography. They're estates where county lines operations, drug networks run by gangs from London and other cities, have embedded themselves over the last decade. Young people get pulled in as runners, as lookouts, as muscle. Some willingly, some not. Some because the alternative is worse. The flat at Vale Green, the one Joe was called to that Friday evening, was what court records described as a crack den. It was being used by a London-based dealer. His name hasn't been made public for legal reasons, but his role in this story is clear. He was dealing drugs from that address, and when 3 armed teenagers showed up trying to rob him, Joe Dix was the person he called. The prosecution described Joe as a friend of the dealer. That word, friend, carries weight in cases like this. It suggests loyalty. It suggests Joe knew what he was walking into. He came armed with a knife because he understood the kind of help being asked for. Joe's parents, Emma and Phil Dix, have never hidden from that complexity. After the trial, they set up the Joe Dix Foundation to raise awareness of child criminal exploitation and knife crime. They've spoken publicly about how young people get drawn into dangerous situations, how loyalty can become a trap, how the structures that should protect teenagers often fail them first. Joe ran toward danger because someone needed him. That's the kind of person he was. Whether that makes him brave or reckless, or both, isn't for us to decide. What matters is that on January 28, 2022, when his phone rang, he answered. But Joe wasn't the only teenager moving through Norwich that Friday. 3 others, Benjamin Gill, Cameron Palmer, Hans B. Harry, had a plan of their own, and it required a key, a car, and weapons. Benjamin Gill, Cameron Palmer, and Hans B. Harry were all 18 years old in January 2022. All from Norwich, all connected through the same networks that Joe Dix moved in. But their plan that Friday wasn't about loyalty. It was about money. They knew about the flat at Vale Green. They knew it was being used as a county lines location, which meant drugs, which meant cash. A soft target, or so they thought. Hans B. Harry had somehow obtained a key to the property. Court records don't specify how he got it, whether it was stolen, borrowed under false pretenses, or handed over by someone inside the network. But he had it, and that key was the foundation of their plan. Shortly before 7 p.m., the 3 of them were driven to Slowbottom Park, a short walk from Vale Green. The identity of the driver was never fully established in open court. An associate, someone who knew enough to drop them off, but not enough or not willing to be named. They walked from the park to the flat, carrying 4 weapons between them. 4 weapons. Let that sit for a moment. One of those weapons was a 24-inch sword, 61 centimeters of steel. Not something you pick up on impulse, not something you shove in a pocket on your way out the door. Someone looked at that blade and thought, bring that. Someone carried it through the streets of Norwich in the early evening, past houses, past people walking dogs, past the kind of ordinary life that doesn't expect a teenager to be holding a sword. That's premeditation. That's not a fight that got out of hand. That's a plan. They reached the flat. B. Harry tried the key. It didn't work. The door stayed shut. The dealer, safe inside, wasn't coming out. Gill, Palmer and B. Harry were now standing outside a locked door with 4 weapons, no access, and a plan that had collapsed before it began. The dealer, trapped inside, did the only thing he could. He called Joe Dix, and Joe, who lived less than a mile away, came running. Joe Dix arrived at Vale Green armed with a knife. He wasn't naive. He knew what he was walking into. When you get a call saying 3 men are trying to rob a drug dealer, you don't show up empty-handed. Joe came prepared to defend someone or himself, or both. What happened next was captured on CCTV. Not the full attack, but the movements around it. The footage that would later be played in court, frame by frame, for a jury to dissect. 3 men chase one. Joe runs. He's outnumbered, out-armed. He tries to get away. Then, minutes later, Joe reappears on camera. Not running this time. Staggering. Moving with the kind of focus that comes from someone badly hurt who knows they need to get home. He's heading back toward Mile Cross, back toward his parents' house, back toward safety that's just out of reach. He doesn't make it. The post-mortem examination, conducted in the days after Joe's death, found 7 stab wounds on his body. The fatal injury was a stab wound to the torso that caused hypervolemic shock, catastrophic blood loss that shut his organs down. He was bleeding out as he walked. At some point during or after the attack, Joe picked up the 24-inch sword. Whether he took it from one of his attackers during the fight or found it dropped nearby, the evidence doesn't make clear. But when police arrived, Joe was clutching that blade, a weapon he hadn't brought. A weapon that had been carried to Vale Green by Gill, Palmer or B. Harry. He collapsed in the road before reaching his door. Police arrived at approximately 7 p.m. Joe was rushed to Norfolk and Norwich University Hospital. He died 1 hour later at 8 p.m., surrounded by doctors who couldn't save him. 18 years old, less than a mile from home. 4 weapons had been at the scene. 7 wounds were on Joe's body. But the evidence trail didn't end in Vale Green. It led directly back to the men who'd run. Detective Superintendent Phil Gray of the Norfolk and Suffolk Major Investigation Team took charge of the case within hours of Joe's death. By the time Gray's team began working the scene, Gill, Palmer and B. Harry were already gone. But they'd left a trail, not in blood or fingerprints, though forensics would play a role. The trail was digital. CCTV cameras throughout Norwich had tracked their movements from Vale Green back to an address on Lefroy Road, where Benjamin Gill lived. The footage showed all 3 arriving, all 3 going inside. And then, hours later, something deliberate happened. At 11:20 p.m. on January 28th, all 3 of their mobile phones dropped off the network. Not 11:15, not 11:30, exactly 11:20 p.m. That kind of coordination doesn't happen by accident. You don't have 3 teenagers independently decide to turn off their phones at the same minute unless someone's told them to. Unless there's a plan. Unless they know the police are coming and they're trying to cut the digital thread that ties them to Vale Green. It didn't work. Investigators spent the next 13 days reconstructing the evening through surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements. They traced the car journey to Slowbottom Park. They mapped the walk to Vale Green. They identified the route back to Lefroy Road. They built a timeline so tight there was no room left for doubt. On February 10th, 2022, before sunrise, officers moved simultaneously on multiple addresses across Norwich. Benjamin Gill arrested. Cameron Palmer arrested. Hans B. Harry arrested. All 3 brought into custody. All 3 cautioned. All 3 offered the chance to explain themselves. In interview, Cameron Palmer was asked what happened at Vale Green. No comment. Hans B. Harry was asked about the weapons, about the key, about the phone going silent at 11:20 p.m. No comment. Benjamin Gill was asked directly if he was responsible for Joe Dix's death. No comment, not one word, not one attempt to deny, explain, or shift blame. Just silence. Coordinated, strategic silence maintained across 3 separate interview rooms, 3 separate solicitors, 3 young men who'd clearly agreed beforehand that saying nothing was the safest option. That silence would hold for months, through charging decisions, through court appearances, through the entire pre-trial process. Gill, Palmer, and B. Harry wouldn't speak until their barristers did it for them. The silence wouldn't break, but the evidence didn't need their words. The trial would lay it all out. And Joe's family would have to sit through every second of it. The trial began at Norwich Crown Court. 5 weeks, 7 men, 5 women on the jury. A courtroom filled with lawyers, police officers, journalists, and in the public gallery, Emma and Phil Dix. Joe's parents attended every day of the trial. They brought a photograph of their son. They brought a pot containing some of his ashes. They sat through 5 weeks of evidence, hearing for the first time the full details of how Joe died, how long he suffered, how close he came to making it home. It was the first time they heard the 999 calls. The first time they saw the CCTV footage of Joe staggering down the street. The first time they learned exactly what weapons had been carried to Vale Green that night, and which one had killed their son. The prosecution's case was built on what Gill, Palmer, and B. Harry had refused to say. CCTV footage showing their movements to and from the scene. Mobile phone data showing the coordinated shutdown at 11:20 p.m. Forensic evidence linking the weapons to the attack. Witness testimony placing all 3 at Vale Green during the time Joe was stabbed. The defense entered not guilty pleas on behalf of all 3 defendants. The specific arguments they raised aren't fully detailed in public records, but the plea itself forced the prosecution to prove every element. It forced Emma and Phil Dix to sit through a trial that could have been avoided with guilty pleas. It meant Joe's death was debated, contested, picked apart for 5 weeks before a verdict could be reached. The jury retired to deliberate. 10 hours later, they returned. On Benjamin Gill, guilty of murder. Cameron Palmer, guilty of murder. Hans B. Harry, guilty of murder. All 3 convicted. All 3 present when Joe Dix was stabbed 7 times and left to die in the road. All 3 legally responsible for his death under joint enterprise laws, whether or not each man personally held a blade. There was a 4th defendant, Yaman Uslu, 19 years old, charged with assisting an offender. The prosecution alleged he'd helped Gill, Palmer, and B. Harry after the attack, either by hiding evidence or providing support that allowed them to evade arrest for 13 days. The jury acquitted him. What Uslu knew, what he did, whether he was genuinely uninvolved or simply not provable beyond reasonable doubt, remains unanswered. But for Gill, Palmer, and B. Harry, the verdict was final. By the time it was delivered on August 30th, 2023, they were 19 years old. A year and 7 months had passed since Joe's death. Now all that remained was sentencing. Guilty. But the verdict was only the beginning of what Emma and Phil Dix had endured, and what they'd continue to endure. Sentencing took place on October 4th, 2023, more than a year after the guilty verdicts were delivered. In English law, murder committed with a knife carries a starting point of 25 years before parole eligibility. That's the baseline. From there, judges consider aggravating factors that can push the sentence higher, or mitigating factors that might bring it down. For Benjamin Gill, Cameron Palmer, and Hans B. Harry, there were no mitigating factors the court found compelling enough to reduce their sentences. But there were aggravating factors, several. Premeditation. They didn't stumble into a fight. They were driven to Vale Green with a plan to commit robbery. They brought 4 weapons, including a 24-inch sword. They obtained a key in advance. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was organized. The number of offenders, 3 against 1. Joe Dix was outnumbered from the moment he arrived. The attack wasn't a fair fight. It was a coordinated assault. Post-offense conduct. The phones going silent at 11:20 p.m. The 13 days of evading arrest. The no-comment interviews. The not guilty pleas that forced a trial and made Joe's family sit through 5 weeks of evidence when a guilty plea could have spared them that ordeal. All of it was weighed by the judge. Benjamin Gill received 27 years minimum, and he was identified as the organizer, the one who brought the others together, the one whose address they returned to after the attack. The extra 2 years above the baseline reflected his leadership role. Cameron Palmer received 25 years minimum. Hans B. Harry received 24 years minimum. Slightly lower, perhaps because of his age or role, but still a sentence that stretches decades into the future. All three were 19 at sentencing. They won't be considered for parole until they're in their mid-40s. Benjamin Gill will be 46. Cameron Palmer, 44. Hans B. Harry, 43. And parole isn't guaranteed. It's not automatic. After serving the minimum term, they'll go before a parole board that will assess whether they're safe to release. If the board says no, they stay in prison. If they're released and re-offend, they go back. A life sentence in England means life. The minimum term is just the point at which the door might open. It's not a promise. Joe Dix was 18 years old when he died. He doesn't have a middle age. He doesn't have a parole hearing. He doesn't get a second chance. While those sentences were being calculated in years and decades, Joe's family were measuring time differently. In vandalized memorials, in social media messages pretending to be their dead son. On February 11, 2022, 2 weeks after Joe's death, Emma and Phil Dix organized a balloon release at Vale Green. Friends, neighbors, people who'd known Joe gathered to remember him, to mark the place where he'd fallen, to do something, anything, in the face of grief that had no outlet yet. That same evening, police called. Benjamin Gill, Cameron Palmer and Hans B. Harry had been charged with murder. Grief and process, delivered in the same phone call. Your son is gone. The men who killed him are now in custody. You'll need to prepare for a trial. Emma and Phil had no way of knowing then that it would take 18 months for that trial to begin. No way of knowing they'd spend 5 weeks sitting in a courtroom hearing how their son died. No way of knowing what would come after the verdict. During the trial, Emma and Phil received messages on social media from accounts pretending to be Joe. Trolls, strangers, people with nothing better to do than torment grieving parents by impersonating their dead child. The messages weren't threats, they were worse. They were cruel for cruelty's sake. Joe's memorial garden in Mile Cross was vandalized, flowers torn up, tributes destroyed. The place where people came to remember him desecrated by someone who either didn't care or actively wanted to hurt his family further. At sentencing, Emma delivered a victim impact statement. She stood in court and spoke directly about what Joe's death had taken from them. One line in particular captures the weight of what she and Phil carry. Joe is now a memory, not a son, not a future, not a person with plans and dreams and decades ahead of him. A memory. That's all that's left. Photographs, stories. A pot of ashes they brought to court because they needed him there, in whatever form they could manage. But Emma and Phil didn't stop at grief. They didn't stop at justice. After the trial, they founded the Joe Dix Foundation. Its mission is to raise awareness of child criminal exploitation and knife crime, and to educate young people about the risks, to push for systemic change that might prevent another family from sitting in a courtroom clutching a photograph and a pot of ashes. They've spoken publicly about county lines, about how young people get drawn into drug networks, about how loyalty and fear and lack of alternatives trap teenagers in situations that can turn lethal in seconds. They've turned Joe's death into something that might, if the work continues, save someone else. It's not closure. There is no closure. But it's purpose. But the foundation can't answer the question the trial never quite asked. How did an 18-year-old end up in that street in the first place? The legal process answered who killed Joe Dix. It answered how. It even answered, to some extent, why they went to Vale Green that night. Robbery, money, drugs. The usual calculus of street-level crime. But there's a deeper why that the trial couldn't address. Not because the evidence was missing, but because it's not a question the criminal justice system is designed to answer. Why did 3 18-year-olds have access to 4 weapons, including a 24-inch sword, and think robbing a drug dealer on a Friday evening was a viable plan? Why was a London-based dealer running a crack den in Norwich with no protection except a phone call to another teenager? Why was Joe Dix's loyalty, his willingness to help a friend in danger, the only safety net available? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're structural ones. First, the county line's infrastructure. Drug networks from London, Liverpool, Manchester, and other cities have spent the last 15 years embedding themselves in smaller towns and cities across Britain. They use local teenagers as runners, as lookouts, as muscle, because teenagers are cheaper, more disposable, and less likely to be on police radar. The flat at Vale Green was one node in a network that stretches across the country. The dealer inside that flat had no security, no backup, no plan except to call Joe. That's not an accident. That's how the system works. Young people are the system's shock absorbers. Second, the weapons. Where did a 24-inch sword come from? Who sold it? Who stored it? Who handed it over to a teenager on the evening of January 28, 2022? Swords that size are legal to own in the UK if kept at home, but carrying one in public without good reason is illegal. Someone bought that blade. Someone kept it accessible. Someone made it available to Gill, Palmer, or B. Harry. The supply chain for weapons in street-level crime doesn't get interrogated in murder trials because the focus is rightly on the act itself. But the sword didn't materialize out of thin air. Third, the question of peer loyalty versus intervention. Joe ran toward danger because someone needed him. That's admirable in one frame, tragic in another. What structures failed that made Joe's loyalty the only option? Where were the adults? Where were the services that should have de-escalated the situation before a teenager with a knife had to show up? County lines operations thrive in the gaps where youth services, mental health support, and community infrastructure have been stripped away. Joe's choice to help wasn't made in a vacuum. It was made in a world where helping meant going armed to a drug den because there was no one else to call. Detective Superintendent Phil Gray, speaking after the verdict, said that carrying knives is completely unacceptable and that lives have been changed forever. He's right. But that statement is both a plea and an admission. It's a plea for people to stop carrying weapons. It's an admission that this keeps happening. Joe Dix answered the phone. That's where this story begins and ends. But the call he answered is still ringing in estates across Britain. 6:48 p.m., January 28, 2022. A phone call. A decision made in less time than it takes to describe. Joe Dix ran toward danger for someone else. Benjamin Gill, Cameron Palmer, and Hans B. Harry came to Vale Green with a sword for themselves. That's the moral architecture of this case. One act of loyalty. One act of predation. Both made by 18-year-olds navigating the same city, the same streets, the same systems that had already failed them in ways big and small. Joe is now a memory. Emma and Phil Dix are keeping that memory alive through the Joe Dix Foundation, raising awareness of child criminal exploitation and knife crime, pushing for change in a system that moves slowly when it moves at all. Their work won't bring Joe back, but it might prevent another family from holding a pot of ashes in a courtroom, waiting for a verdict that can't undo what's been done. The trial answered the legal questions. Who killed Joe Dix? Benjamin Gill, Cameron Palmer, Hans B. Harry. How long will they serve? 27, 25, 24 years minimum. Will they ever be released? Maybe, when they're in their 40s, if a parole board decides they're no longer a risk. But the question Detective Superintendent Phil Gray posed, what does it mean that we keep losing young people to knives they shouldn't have access to, remains unanswered. Not because we don't know the answer, because the answer requires acknowledging that Joe Dix's death wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was a predictable outcome in a system where teenagers are expected to navigate county lines operations, weapon availability, and peer loyalty, with no meaningful adult infrastructure to catch them when things go wrong. Joe made a choice. So did Gill, Palmer, and B. Harry. But the world that shaped those choices, the world that made a 24-inch sword accessible to teenagers and a phone call to another teenager, the only defense a drug dealer could muster, that world is still here. And the work of remembering Joe is the work of changing it. If this case has affected you, or if you have information about knife crime or child exploitation in your area, contact your local police or support services. The links and resources vary by region, but help is available. Use it. Thank you for watching.